Hi, SJ. How you doing?
I'm good. So I think it'll be a nice place to start if we just start talking a bit about you, um, about what you're doing with Debrief, and a bit about your experiences. So your experience with good storytelling and bad storytelling about disability.
Thanks, SJ. I've got different hats that I'm wearing there. I'm a disabled person myself. I have been all my life. I grew up in Britain. As you know, a lot of my work was then in international development and cooperation, which is how we met in Bangladesh. And that's taken me onto a new media project to find new ways of storytelling and sharing information and knowledge about disability. This is one of those subjects where we're really trying to change public perceptions, and communications by the non-profit sector can really help contribute to that. And unfortunately, there's also this risk that they can make them worse, right? From the disability point of view, we really want to see disabled people as empowered, full citizens, living full lives. And unfortunately, all too often, communications doesn't do that. Communications might really focus on a kind of a pity narrative, that, oh, this poor kid can't go to school, doesn't have anything, stigma in the community, blah, 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 and it kind of gets, it gets into kind of a tragedy narrative. And then on the other side, it can get into, we call this inspiration porn. I really encourage people to look up TED Talk by Stella Young, where that phrase was coined, and she used that to talk about how people are kind of consuming these stories of disabled people in this quite icky way that serves as a lesson of life to them, or is more about the person viewing it than about the person themselves. So that might be a story like, oh, this person doesn't have this thing, but then they overcame it, and then that means that anyone can do anything, and narratives like that, or the kind of a narrative like, look, this person doesn't have X, Y, or Z, but you do. This is kind of like, some people take that as a life lesson, but again, that's kind of that's not focusing on the person themselves. So I think our goal is how to find stories that bring back a dignity that isn't always granted by society, that bring a sense of possibility and joy and opportunity in life, and one that, this is really important, how we combine storytelling of individual issues with storytelling that tackles social barriers. And there's a lot we can say on that, but we can't just make things about an individual when we see so much of what is disabling someone is because of social barriers, is because of inaccessible infrastructure, is because of societal attitudes, is because something isn't available in a school, or the employer discriminates against you. And so that, like, it's a really interesting and fascinating mix, but I think it gets better stories in the end as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that last point is such an important one, isn't it? That I think that the sector is often looking for human stories, but so often in situations like in disability, that person is absolutely fine. It's all of the people and the infrastructure around them that are making that be a disability.
And it's like, how do you bring out the human stories? Sometimes people with disabilities are used to illustrate in that kind of tragedy way, like how bad circumstances get and how desperate circumstances get. And okay, so we're a marginalized community. We often do face quite extreme situations, but let's not leave our storytelling there. Like, you've got to kind of like capture the hardship, but like also capture this person is doing things with their lives that different disabled people, it is just as different as anyone else, and to kind of allow an audience to relate with it in a kind of more complex human level, rather than just the kind of that pity response or that inspiration response.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that nuance and that detail and that depth is what really makes a story. I guess I'm interested in hearing when that, what do you think that when we miss out on that, when we're just telling these very surface level stories that, like you said, kind of slip under either the route of pity or tragedy, or the route of kind of maybe a bit over optimistic or inspirational, when we go down either of those routes and we miss out on all the stuff around and all the nuance, I feel like not only we not getting a good story, which is often not very effective, and studies have shown that now, which is really helpful, but also the world is kind of missing out, right, on everything that we can learn, and the genuine inspiration and joy that we can get, and from that story.
Yeah, absolutely, and we're missing out on several things. Like, first, it's a boring story, right? Like, it's been done before. Like, we're kind of wasting everyone's time in reading it. Like, second, we're like, I assume we're all here because we're motivated by social change. We're missing out on an opportunity to contribute to social change, right? Which is to kind of highlight and challenge these barriers, and to change people's understandings and expectations of things, right? And then third, I would say, like, we're missing out on the person, right? I think an example in Stella Young's talk was something like, oh, she was just getting congratulated for going to school, right? She just gets a prize for doing something very basic. And that there's many things that she deserves to get a prize for, but that wasn't one of them. So you're missing out on, like, how is the person different? There's something like, to make it kind of concrete, is that often we get very absorbed by what the specific disability is, right? So I get a little bit frustrated with so many stories that start with, like, identifying just the person's disability. Oh, this person, like, is 13 years old, and, like, when they're 5 they had this disease, or they were hit by a car, or when they were born they were X, Y, and Z. Like, why are we putting that, like, so up front on the business card, right? Like, why is that the always this introduction we're using? You can why not show someone's complexity? Like, this 13-year-old loves maths, like, fighting with their siblings, and when they're 5 they had this thing, right? That is kind of much more interesting character, if you even have to put it in the first line. I think we also can get a bit over obsessed about, like, oh, what disease or what car accident it was. Like, does that matter? Why should we get into people's medical histories? You can say, look,
we wouldn't do that with anyone else, right?
Yeah, they've got a situation. We don't need to read the doctor's report. Like, when I meet disabled people, I'm a bit less focused on, like, that doctor's report. Sometimes you get into it, obviously, but not always. A bit more focused on, like, how does it impact your day-to-day life? Like, how does it relate with what you do on a micro basis, like how you get dressed and how you do other day-to-day things, and then on a bigger basis, so, like, what do you do for work? What have been your opportunities and limitations? How have you designed your life in, like, relation to that, and, like, how does it combine with your interests? So that's kind of things that we need to do to stop, like people can react to disability, and it takes them off that complexity thing, and it means that they miss the point. As you know, I have a physical disability, and then people can kind of see that, and then they're like, oh, like, I know what, like, Peter's main issue is, and like, that often is not my main issue in life, right? Like, I've got, that isn't my main problem. That isn't my main challenge. I've got other sort of, I mean, many other things going on that are more challenging than that. So yeah, it's not to get totally stopped by this situation of difference. To go past our first reactions on that, which might be, like, I mean, they can be quite complex, or of shock, and sometimes it's not easy to contemplate someone's life or appearance or whatever personal issues we have. But let's not get, that's about us, and let's get beyond our initial reaction so we can make it more about the people that we're writing about.
Yeah, absolutely, and they're great points. It's I think a kind of a nice tip for storytellers who will be listening into this is that don't make those assumptions. Like you're saying, don't go in and kind of have this assumption that because you can see something, or because something's on a medical report, that's the biggest thing that either defines them or is defining their daily life. Like, don't go in with those assumptions about anyone's life, right? And like you said, I think another important thing is, like, it can be really othering. So, one of the things that I often think about with storytelling is concentrate on what brings us together, concentrate on what's similar in our lives, concentrate on the fact that whatever, whether it's fashion or it's current affairs or it's travel or it's something. I think when I think about you and I, that connection about travel and that sort of thing comes much higher, rather than thinking about things that might, be different between us, which is, I think there's a huge...
I think that gets to a really important example, SJ, because if you introduced me to someone, you probably wouldn't put, like, oh, Peter was born with a type of whatever in the first line, right? Like, you would mention the work that I do, or our shared interests or something, and that's how we treat our colleagues and our friends. And so why is it a different description, right, when we're writing a story? So it really is to get to that. I think that othering is like, it's kind of it's complicated, especially when you're writing across cultures and across situations where there might be a big difference in resources. Part of the othering might also to be just seeing the gaps and the difficulties, and not how that person and that community has made other solutions and whatnot. I think that when we talk about social change, we kind of, othering can then get us into this kind of progress mindset that, like, oh, if we're writing it from a rich country, that our countries are so much better on this, or that, like, are inevitably better on this. But I think the world is showing us very clearly that social progress is not inevitable. The even countries that think they've been working on these issues for many years have lots of gaps and lots of baked in structures that a country recently adopting disability issues and having different long-standing solutions on a community level isn't going to have. So it's also to kind of get out of that better worse thing, and get out of just seeing the gaps. I think, like, both of us love Bangladesh so much because you see so many creative solutions, and you see some terrible things, but you also see real innovation about inclusion that you just wish that, like, when we come back to the UK or Australia, people could sort of adopt that flexibility and take on new things. That's that othering is, I think, a really important aspect, and I think it kind of gets really compounded when you've got someone from a minority community, and then from like a different culture, as well. And I know you want to talk about intersectionality, and maybe we can get onto that a bit more directly as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Just one point that kind of rings in my head about what you said about, how you introduce yourself to your friends. I think that's such a great point, thinking about with storytelling. Think about how that person would introduce themselves to their friends. It's definitely not going to be that you're not going to say the first thing, "Oh, I have this disability." So,
when is that how my friends and colleagues introduce me is also
absolutely
what I meant, and that I'm quite struck by that. The way this, I think, is a sort of really important point for non-profits, that the way we talk about the people we are supposedly serving is not the way we talk about people that we see as our peers. And I think that gets to a really broken part of non-profit storytelling. And this disability example is kind of illustration of how, when we're kind of othering the people or group that we're serving, we're highlighting issues that we wouldn't highlight if we saw them as equals, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's really dangerous, and it's really awful to compound that. Too many nonprofits do that, and they need to really try and dial that down.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a great point. One of the, and we definitely go into intersectionality, or might come into this. I feel like in my experience, a lot of people go in and they might go in with all the right intentions. They're excited about, telling the story of a person with a disability. I guess I'm wondering if they're going in with the right intentions, but it's easy to slip up, right? So people are, a little nervous. So I'm guessing what strikes you as some kind of, basic advice that you would give to somebody who's coming in and wanting to tell a story. And I think, there's kind of, I think there's almost like guidance that you would give generally, but, with a person with disability, it's maybe a bit more that you would give. What are the things you would tell somebody, things on the do's and maybe things on the don'ts side of things as well?
So one of the kind of key concerns that people have is about what language to use. And there is a bit of a challenge, as there isn't a globally accepted thing. If you're working internationally, most people use persons with disability. However, there are sort of quite strident disability movements and majority, say in the UK, that would not prefer that. They prefer disabled people, right? So I think there isn't an easy way around that. But I think if you're doing it for an international audience, then maybe say persons with disability. If you're doing it for the national audience, see what your national term is, right? Obviously, avoid stigmatized terms and stigmatizing language, and avoid kind of euphemisms like differently abled or special abilities or stuff like that. As for the do's, I think we're talking about a lot of them, about that kind of complexity. And what I would really encourage people is to use their storytelling skills, right? We need new stories. We need people with storytelling skills to tell them. Some people kind of forget the skills that they have when they come to a subject that they're uncomfortable with, right? And so there will be tricky things in that, for sure, about sort of the way you're kind of relating with people, even the way you have to kind of communicate and do the story. You might need accessibility provisions. You might need to kind of structure it a little bit differently. But with that, use the storytelling skills that you have to make a story that can contribute to change. And there was another point that's just gone out of my head.
No worries. While you're thinking on it, I think that line is such a nice one, isn't it? Keep in mind that you're trying to contribute to change when you're writing a story. So it's, you know, it's not something that you're not, you know, writing something which you're trying to just have, you know, whether it's like sympathy or inspiration or something, you're actually trying to change something. So, you know, maybe keep those, you know, whatever it is, like stereotypes that people have, and consciously try to, you know, contribute towards changing the audience.
Yeah, and it's so that sort of reminds me of the other do really is about making prominent the voice of people with disabilities, right? Too often we've had other people speaking for us, right? Like maybe it's a medical professional, maybe it's our family member, maybe it's a kind of government official, whatever. They've been speaking for us and taking the decisions for us. So obviously sometimes you need like a range of different perspectives, including people from those categories. But as much as possible, try to hear from, say, people themselves and to share their voice more widely. That will be a really great way of contributing to change. And yeah, I mean, show the complexity. I think that I mean, I'm sure you kind of you face this in all the other issues. So much of non-profit communication is very boring. This is people saying like very predictable things about how they're upset that they don't have something, and wouldn't the world be fantastic if everyone was included? And some people do speak like that, but they're not speaking like that all the time, and it's maybe not the most interesting thing that they're saying. And if they do say it, it's much more motivating if you've understood them as a person and in their uniqueness before. So that's somewhat beyond the kind of like, this is definitely far beyond a disability issue. But I really wish non-profit communication could like just sort of take a step back from seeing it so functionally that we have to tell a story that like serves this purpose, and have more room for different complexity, more room to get to know the people, and like they're going to say contradictory and like confusing things, and that's the magic. That's the magic of humanity.
No, I think that's a great takeaway. That and embracing that magic and that messiness of humanity, right? Is that it's not formulaic, and that's because life isn't formulaic, and nobody's journey is. I think one of the problems is that a lot of these are very linear, right? A lot of the stories that are written are very linear. So important to bring that nuance and talk about all the things that have happened and all of the potholes and, you know, diversions that have happened before, you know, in between A and B.
I think that's a great metaphor for it, because disability is a constant, is a sort of a constant pothole creation life. There are lots of sort of surprising, like, and bizarre little barriers that one faces, and it's sort of really, like, I mean, you're going along a familiar path and there's suddenly something like in your way and it's become inaccessible, like, for instance, or like a pothole, for instance, and that's it kind of makes things a lot less predictable, and you kind of have to people react in very different ways to that. Some people get angry, some people get like sad, some people just ignore it, and that's there's a lot of creativity and messiness in the disability experience, and kind of bringing that out can be like a really interesting aspect of what people's lives are like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even, you know, when we're looking at that, we can also, people can pull out nuggets that relate to their own lives, right? We all have, you know, I often, it's fantastic when you can read stories that are written by NGOs that aren't just kind of saying, that aren't so linear, and you can say, oh, actually, I'd love to meet this person. This is inspiring. This has got advice for my own life. This is a really interesting, like, you know, I face similar things, or really helps to build that great rapport so that you, see people as...
And as to, probably need to kind of sort of clarify that, because like the stories you get life advice from aren't where they're telling you platitudes of life advice.
Absolutely.
Right? They are where, like,
Absolutely.
the ability to resonate and relate to it isn't because they're saying, oh, this guy has problems just like you, or this guy is sad, you've also been sad, but to like really get into that, like a kind of that individuality and complexity, and see how it's relating with stuff, and then that shows you a different dimension, and a different way of looking at your own life.
Absolutely. Definitely not an overt thing, is it? Very much more it comes out organically through.
And this is something that I've found in the power of storytelling, particularly from the point of view of sharing my own disability experience, that when I've been able to share with people in writing or poetry or personally or however, things that I've been through that have really isolated me, that I've really experienced in an individual way, and I thought were just my cross to bear, and sort of were very difficult for me to process. When I've found ways to share that with people and they've resonated with it, it's kind of really transformative for both sides. So that is part of what that power of storytelling can do. You can take the thing that was isolating, was exclusionary, made people separate, was seen as othering, and turn that into a means of connection. Like I really believe in this power of storytelling, but that absolutely comes from more complex storytelling, not the preachy do-gooder, heard it before, platitude-filled NGO communication that we know and love.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The invest in the messiness is I think it's a great takeaway.
That is a great takeaway. Yeah.
So when I know we talked a little bit earlier about intersectionality. So tell us a little bit more about that, because obviously we're talking about telling better stories of disability, but there's a whole lot within that space. So just want to
this is it's really important, and there are kind of few ways into this. One is that the population of people with disabilities is very diverse, right? There are many sort of different forms of disability, but also like disability happens in all population groups. So the kind of usual suspects on the disability scene are kind of people with physical disabilities or people with visual impairments, and we definitely need to get beyond usual suspects. In particular, men with disabilities often have kind of very prominent voice, and one that's too prominent within the disability community. And then the other form of intersectionality that we need to look at is that people are more than one thing at once, right? People are like have many different identities in that social sense. There might be a woman, an older person, and a person with disability. For instance, there might be an indigenous person and a person with disability, or whatever it is. They're in or population. There might be someone that's quite well off and a person with disability. There might be a politician or whatever. But that kind of there's that lot of diversity then in those other social roles, what they're doing and what they do as a profession or otherwise, or what they do in their daily lives, where and how they live. And so it's kind of I think you kind of need to sort of like a good rule of thumb is then generalize too much, or to be kind of careful in generalizations. And sometimes like the people you're speaking to might say, like all persons with disabilities are X, Y, and Z. Okay, fine, and like you can show some of that, but it's often much more complex than that. So to kind of respect that generalization, I think as storytellers, then when you meet people, you might go into it like thinking, this is a disabled person, I'm going to talk to them about disability. Like, give them a chance to kind of talk about other things as well, right? And maybe like they have a different identity, or they see that differently, or whatever, or they don't want to separate it out from, say, their Indigenous identity, or whatever it is. So it's another reminder about that complexity, and like the storyteller letting exploring the story and seeing what it is, rather than being knowing beforehand what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's such a nice takeaway as well, is that idea of multiple identities, and let somebody define their own identity and how they want to be known, rather than going in and assuming any of these things or generalizing. They're not going to be like the person you spoke to last week. I was interested in we've talked a bit about kind of bad examples. Have you seen, because you spend a lot of time in that space, have you, in terms of doing, you put together Debrief, etc., so you're seeing a lot of stories, is there anyone that's doing storytelling really well, or have you come across any tools or any, you mentioned one, TED Talk, is there others that kind of come to mind in terms, and what was special about them?
Good question. I think they're really interesting examples of people using art and creativity and sort of new ways of talking about things. You can see a lot of this on social media, which is, with all its faults, also being a platform where disabled people, often as individuals, can really talk about the disability experience in a different way, and like very engaging way, and bring all the kind of the creativity to that. There's a really nice project in India called Revival Disability India. I always appreciate their celebration of Valentine's Day, which they celebrate as Criplentine's Day, and it's really provocative. They have great illustrations. They have kind of stories that kind of really challenge a lot of your perceptions, and they kind of it's really exciting. On the Debrief, I've just interviewed a photographer called Chris Tasso, who did a really interesting photography series with disabled people around the world, and he's also sort of partly escaping the NGO space, but he spoke that it was kind of challenging for NGOs to give value to that different form of storytelling, to give value to a form of storytelling that the people with disabilities themselves, they decided how they wanted their pictures taken, and it was outside of where they benefited by some project or other. So I kind of see that art and creativity and whatnot, but I also see that NGOs can really contribute just by spending a longer time with people and kind of documenting a nice little interview and sharing it, and maybe get people off the more beaten track of just what policy change they wanna have. But those stories are so valuable, especially from communities that you don't sort of hear from in regular media, or we don't have access to those voices. I think that NGOs can make a real contribution by just sort of having a bit of some nice photographs and a nice video, or a nice conversation, and take it beyond just what your project is doing.
I like what you're saying, particularly about using, art. I particularly feel like we've seen some really powerful examples, particularly using humour, because disability tends to be a somewhat uncomfortable topic for some people. It can be scary to talk about it. You don't really know how to talk about it. And I feel like, art and humour can really help people to break it down, put everyone on a level playing field. They're all cracking up laughing, and then it's a much easier, more free-flowing kind of
for sure. And that's going to speak to allowing the individuality and kind of uniqueness of someone coming out, because this humor isn't going to happen if we're sort of trying to follow the guidelines too much.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just remembering I was at a talk a while ago, and I was a man. Nobody knew he was blind, but the conversation was about disability, and he took the stage and he said, "All right, can everyone see me?" And everyone said, "Yeah," and he said, "That's great because I can't see anyone."
No, so he's used that rapport to kind of break down the boundaries, but it also speaks to, I think, one of the reasons that social media and whatnot is so effective is that ultimately the most profound way to change attitudes on disabled people is more exposure to disabled people and their lives. The more substance that you can get into, and the more you can give something people can relate to and its complexity, the more that will change their ideas on disability.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really powerful note to end on, actually, about that idea of this is the reason for investing in that nuance, is because that's what's going to make change. If you can see that representation and you can have that relatability, then that's what's going to actually make the change that, at the end of the day, most of the people telling these stories, NGOs are wanting to make. They're purporting to, make change. So that's the way to do it, is by investing in that, in that nuance.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was fantastic, Peter. Is there anything else that you wanted to add that you think that we've missed, or any kind of parting words that you would have for anyone embarking on writing a story about disability, words of wisdom for them?
I'll just add something that I'm trying to do with the disability debrief, SJ. Disability is a lens into seeing many different areas of life, right? On the debrief, I've used it to write about artificial intelligence, to everything to ancient Egypt. So it's not something that's just about health programs or benefits or accessibility. It's a way of showing us what is the latest, the latest technology. How is the way our cities are designed? How our social interactions work. What are our assumptions about how someone participates in a space? There are other good examples that I forgot to mention. There was Apple did a video for Disability Day last year. It's called "I'm the Greatest." And it's kind of an advertisement for Apple tech, but it's also an advertisement for disabled people looking absolutely beautiful, great soundtrack, baller lives, and just smashing it. And it kind of really it really vibrates. So yeah, there's that not to see kind of disability as the end point, but as something that through meeting disabled people and through using some of the questions that throws up, can throw new perspectives on the world.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an interesting point. Just before we close, and it's one that that I've heard a bit and seen a bit, is that when like you were saying in the beginning about when stories about disability are told, they're often told through this kind of sympathy to the point of tragedy lens. The commercial sector, however, tends to sometimes do it really well. So they portray disability in a way which isn't kind of tokenistic and inspirational, but rather genuinely great to watch. And so I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on that. Do you think there's a few lessons that that NGOs could learn from the corporate sector, specifically in terms of being able to tell those stories that and not in a pity or a tragedy lens, but rather in something that genuinely makes you feel good.
Yeah, I guess the corporate sector is good at selling stuff, right? And making people feel that it's part of something bigger. And unfortunately, NGOs, even though like the message is kind of on our side as it's our work, we haven't been very good like sort of NGO communications that like is sort of like sexy and appealing and sort of like makes you feel better and like gives you a bit of a buzz for going on with your day. Yeah, I think that's a really nice point you brought out there, SJ, on like how how the like the corporate side has kind of storytelling and publicity techniques that we can definitely learn from.
I mean, absolutely, particularly when we've got research now that shows that it's actually equal, the inspirational response and the appealing positive response and the pity. Actually, the pity doesn't return better outcomes. So, there's nothing stopping us from kind of doing these sexy, exciting, be part of a movement. And you should feel good because a lot of the time people are giving money to something which is great and going to really impact people's lives. More than selling a sneaker perhaps could do. So, nothing to stop us from
why is like the latest iPhone more attractive than making a world where we treat each other better and we're happier? Yeah?
I mean, I think there's definitely, it's a great lens to think about, that there's that whole space and a lot of, things to learn from.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That's wonderful, Peter. I think that's all the questions. Thank you so much.